Hi, I'm Suzanne Williams, author of the Tennis Fitness course, and I'm excited that I'm putting this video together because it's all about the courts being open and people are getting back on court playing the sport that they love. This video is here to help you understand what happens to your body when you train, especially when you haven't been training for 8 weeks, or at least haven't been on a tennis court for 8 weeks. So I want to arm you with the knowledge so that you can make more informed decisions of how much tennis to play yourself, your children, or the players that you coach. So what we'll be looking at today is understanding what happens in our bodies when we train, understanding fatigue and overtraining, and the on and off court strategies which coaches, players and parents can use to facilitate safe return to play. The question I want to ask is, are you being strategic in the return to tennis of yourself, your players or your child? The biggest concern is that the players will come out of the gates too fast, and I get it. They haven't played for 8 weeks, they've got so much to catch up on, etc, etc. But these are unprecedented times. We don't have a point of reference or even past experience to draw upon. Something that has been looked at is the NFL lockout in 2011, where work stoppage imposed by the owners meant that players weren't able to officially train for 4.5 months. Their first play back was 3 weeks after returning. Lots of research has looked into the effects of the lockout, including injury incidents. The average Achilles tendon rupture incidence across a whole season is 8. Upon returning to training, 10 ruptures happened within 2 weeks. We rarely get a chance to research what happens when a fit and healthy individual is simply kept away from their sport for a prolonged period of time. So let's refer to the science of what happens within our bodies when we take part in physical activity and make decisions based on that. We've only got one chance to get coming back from lockdown right. So this is the area that I want to talk about today, the one that we really have to focus on and get right. Shock and adaptation are terms used in sports science. So the shock represents how much volume and intensity we ask of the player and how quickly their body can respond and change to be able to cope with a similar environment in the future is the adaptation. Coaches, players and parents may think of these terms as workload and improvement. So first things first, let's take a look at what happens when we train. And what may surprise some people is that it's not the training itself which improves performance. Improvements are only achieved when matched with recovery. So let's take a look at a universally accepted model of the process, the general adaptation syndrome. The black line, the baseline, refers to the current physical ability of the player. The loading and overreaching refers to the player working at a level beyond what they can comfortably work. For example, they're asked to make a technical change that's not easy to them, or something which makes them intensify their efforts to achieve, or they might be working on loading their legs more on their forehand, so they repeat the action over and over to groove the movement. This would be considered the loading or the overreaching, or as mentioned earlier, shock. This then overloads the body and so it fatigues, and so the level drops. During the recovery time, their body basically rearranges itself so that the next time it's more competent at that task. During the recovery time, not only do they reach the baseline that they were originally at, but they move beyond it to where they reach a peak known as supercompensation. This is where we would consider the adaptation. Things then settle a little, an amount of detraining takes place. But ultimately, you can see that the new baseline is higher than the original baseline. When the player does recover, this pattern repeats itself over and over and everyone is happy. Work, overload, recovery, adaptation. work, overload, recovery, adaptation. So a new improved tennis level or physical capacity level is attained. And the purpose of this video is to look at strategies to help us achieve this outcome. But before we do that, I'd like to just zoom in a little on what happens during this overload phase. First of all, let's point out that this phase is not the enemy, because without being overloaded, the body wouldn't be triggered to adapt. But what does actually happen during this overload? Amongst other things, the player will experience fatigue in the form of nervous system fatigue and muscle fatigue. Nerves are responsible for controlling the contractions of muscles, determining the sequence, the number, and the force of the muscular contraction. But during powerful and repeated contractions, such as serving at full force or sprinting to chase a ball, etc., something that feels close to the upper limit of a muscle's ability to generate force, nervous fatigue, also known as the nerve signal weakening, can be a limiting factor in untrained individuals. And whether we like it or not, many of the players we're talking about are currently relatively untrained. The muscle's ability to generate force is most strongly determined by the nerve's ability to sustain a high-frequency signal. After a period of maximum contraction, the nerve signal reduces in frequency and the force generated by the contraction diminishes. There's no sensation of pain or discomfort. The muscle appears to simply stop listening and gradually cease to contract. The players are not tired in the typical sense, but they still can't perform. Playing tennis builds up the nervous system's robustness to playing tennis. Similarly, not playing tennis results in the opposite. When a player does something they haven't done in a while, the nervous system is not resilient, even if they used to play a lot. It's a use it or lose it scenario. When the nervous system is fatigued, there's no playing through it. The only solution is recovery. And also from a coaching perspective, more than ever, we need to prioritize quality over quantity. So let's take a look at what happens if we don't get this right and we work them too hard and then the overload becomes too great. The dotted line represents what happens if the player has overdone it. They go into a deeper state of stress or fatigue, which in itself would require extra recovery. But shown here, we can see that too little recovery results in the base level of tennis or physical ability level being even lower than before the training took place. All that effort gone to waste. Repeating this cycle and becoming in a chronic state of being overtrained is surprisingly easily done and doesn't require what might be considered excessive training, since the important point here is the balance between training and rest and recovery. Would you know if you or your players were overtrained? The physical symptoms here are for an overtrained player, which we could see would impact their ability to play and compete. Would it trigger you as a coach to amend the sessions in any way? At Tennis Fitness course, a core philosophy is person first, player second. The symptoms of being overtrained for the person can be seen here. Pretty impactful stuff. It's quite common for juniors to show signs of overtraining, often because their activity levels, which include other sports and PE, etc., along with the psychological stresses of competing and school exams and lockdown and so on, place more stresses on their body than their rest and recovery allows for. The stresses and concerns that a player may experience during a global pandemic, coupled with worries of homeschooling and family health, and then coming back to tennis and feeling that they need to do everything they can to not lose what they already had, is a perfect storm for overtrain. To me, there really is a right and a wrong way to do this. So how can we apply the sports science knowledge that we've just discussed? And how can we appropriately manage their workload and their rest and recovery? When I first looked into this, my thoughts were that the workload gets managed on court in the session, and that the rest and recovery is for off-court, but it's not that simple. First of all, how many of us actually measured workload pre-lockdown? Mostly our players don't wear heart rate monitors, and it's not like our sport is a running track session where the athlete has a prescribed number of laps to do, etc. And while we're on the subject of rest and recovery, it's important to understand the differences so they can be implemented properly. Rest is most easily defined as a combination of sleep and time spent not training. So if you trained 8 hours a week, the other 160 hours are left for rest if you don't do anything else. Whereas recovery refers to techniques and actions taken to maximize your body's repair. Both are equally important. Okay, but coming back to the challenge of getting this right. The final consideration, and possibly the most crucial, is knowing the athlete. Some players have maintained a great level of physical training throughout lockdown. Some have done something reasonably regularly, but perhaps not that strategic, such as cycling. And some have done nothing for the 8 weeks. It's my opinion that we can't make informed decisions about how to facilitate a safe return to play without knowing what physical condition our athletes are currently in. So here are some physical benchmarks. I've got a list of can they and have they. The can they list is easily assessed by the coach, looking for good form and stability for the strength type exercises, and that with the skipping it can be done without any breaks. The have they exercises are more a case of, do you know what they've been doing during lockdown? Can you be sure that they've been taking care of their mobility and their functional strength? Once you've established if the player can achieve the physical benchmarks, they could be split into 2 categories. Can they achieve the benchmarks, yes, easily, or no, not very easily? If the answer is yes, easily, then this might be their return to court schedule. We've split it into weeks, and you can see week 1 and 2 is a maximum of every other day. For week 1, the duration is 60 minutes per session, with a session volume of 50%, and for week 2, the maximum duration is 75 minutes per session, still with a session volume of 50%. Session volume relates to the number of balls the player hits in that session. So this would be a subjective measure from the coach to reduce by 50%. Changes are made in weeks 3 and 4, where the schedule may be more like 2 days on, 1 day off, and 3 days on, 2 days off, with the session duration increasing and the session volume increasing until ultimately it can ramp up to normal play with no restrictions. If, however, the player couldn't achieve their physical benchmarks, or certainly not very easily, their return to court schedule might look more like this, and you can see there's a greater number of weeks to allow for more of a phased increase. And some further on-court considerations. Always perform a full ramp warm-up, raise, activate, mobilize and potentiate. Of course, the ramp warm-up can be done before turning up, but I'd recommend that certainly in the first week they're done with the coach. It's a perfect time for the coach to see where the player is at physically and allocate the workload accordingly. For more information on ramp warm-ups, check out the tennisfitnesscourse.com. I would also consider taping the wrists and ankles. This isn't something that I would normally advocate in a healthy individual long term, but tendons in these joints will have become less robust in the time off, so supporting them in the beginning could be a good thing. And then the next few things are common sense, but that's not always common practice. So when we start hitting in the boxes and even consider lower compression balls. There's less distance to travel and less impact on contact in the boxes. When you do move back to the baseline, go straight up and down the line. Again, less distance to travel. Progress on to cross-court drilling. That way you're only covering the angles. Then you could progress onto patterns rather than full play, because full play is more chaotic. Consider that when you are changing direction, when you know where you're about to go, up to 5 times your body weight goes down through your joints. But when you change direction without knowing where you're going to go, so you're simply reacting, up to 8 times your body weight goes down through your joints. Consider the shock in the body. And finally, the further off-court considerations are to maintain good functional strength and mobility for the key joints, and to pay good attention to the recovery techniques of hydration, nutrition, sleep, and showering, all of which are discussed in more detail on the tennisfitnesscourse.com. I really hope that you found that useful and that you have a safe return to tennis.